A waitress saw his torn sneakers and faded jacket and decided he didn't belong in her upscale restaurant. What she didn't know was that the broke college kid she just humiliated was about to become the youngest tech billionaire in the city's history. The crystal chandeliers of Le Bernardin cast dancing shadows across marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. The soft clink of fine china and whispered conversations of Manhattan's elite created a symphony of sophistication that had echoed through these halls for over 2 decades. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a temple of culinary excellence where reservations required 6-month waiting lists and where a single meal could cost more than most people's monthly rent. Marcus Thompson pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, the scent of truffle oil and aged wine immediately filling his nostrils. His worn Nike sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor as he adjusted his faded Columbia University hoodie, the same one he'd worn through countless all-nighters, coding in his dorm room. At 24, Marcus looked every bit the struggling graduate student he'd been just 18 months ago, his backpack slung over one shoulder, containing a laptop that held the key to a revolution no one could see coming. The hostess glanced up from her marble podium, her smile faltering as her eyes traced from Marcus's face down to his attire. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the practiced politeness that barely concealed disdain. "But we do require a jacket for gentlemen dining this evening." "I have a reservation," Marcus replied quietly, his voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. "Thompson, party of one, 8 o'clock. She tapped her manicured nails against the screen, her expression growing more skeptical with each second. "I'm not seeing that reservation in our system. Perhaps you meant to book somewhere else?" Behind her, waitress Sandra Mitchell had been arranging wine glasses when she caught sight of the exchange. At 32, Sandra had worked at Le Bernardin for 3 years, long enough to develop what she considered a refined sense of who belonged and who didn't. Her sharp blue eyes took in Marcus's appearance with practiced judgment, the frayed hem of his jeans, the scuffed sneakers, the way he shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny. "Probably walked in off the street," Sandra whispered to her colleague Melissa, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "They always think they can just waltz into places like this. Look at those clothes. He couldn't afford our appetizers, let alone a full meal." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he reached into his backpack, pulling out his phone. The screen displayed his confirmed reservation, complete with confirmation number and his platinum Amex details from the booking. "Here's my confirmation," he said, extending the phone toward the hostess. The hostess barely glanced at it. "Our system shows no availability for walk-ins tonight. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Sandra approached, her heels clicking authoritatively against the marble. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Her eyes swept over Marcus again, lingering on his backpack with visible distaste. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This establishment has certain standards." "I understand your standards," Marcus interrupted, his voice remaining calm despite the fire building in his chest. "I'm simply trying to honor a reservation I made and paid for in advance." Sandra exchanged a knowing look with the hostess. "Paid for? I find that hard to believe. Do you have any idea what dinner costs here? This isn't McDonald's." The words hung in the air like poison, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of assumptions pressing down on him. Assumptions that had followed him from his childhood in Harlem to the halls of Columbia. Assumptions that seemed to follow him everywhere. Despite his achievements, what they didn't know was that the young man they were dismissing so casually had spent the last 18 months building something extraordinary in his small apartment. What they couldn't see was that his cheap clothes masked a mind that had just revolutionized artificial intelligence, creating an algorithm that would transform how the world understood technology forever. And what they were about to discover was that sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones who look like they don't belong there at all. Before we continue with Marcus's story, I want to ask you something important. If you've ever been judged by your appearance, if you've ever felt invisible because of what you were wearing or where you came from, hit that subscribe button. This channel is dedicated to stories that matter. Stories about real people who prove that worth isn't measured by designer labels or zip codes. On a scale of 1 to 10, how angry are you feeling right now about how Marcus is being treated? Drop your number in the comments, and let's see how fired up this community gets when we witness injustice. And if you want to see how this story unfolds, trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Make sure that notification bell is turned on because this is just the beginning. Marcus Thompson had learned to navigate two worlds from the time he could walk. By day, he sat in lecture halls at Columbia University, surrounded by students whose monthly allowances exceeded his family's annual income. By night, he returned to a studio apartment in Washington Heights, where his mother, Carmen, worked double shifts as a nurse to keep their lights on and food on the table. The apartment was barely 400 square feet, but every inch told a story of sacrifice and determination. Carmen's nursing textbooks sat next to Marcus's computer science journals on a hand-me-down desk that wobbled whenever he typed too enthusiastically. The walls were covered with his academic achievements, Dean's List certificates, programming competition awards, and acceptance letters to graduate programs, each one representing another step toward a dream that sometimes felt impossible to reach. Marcus's daily routine had been the same for 4 years. Wake at 5 a.m., work on his personal coding projects until 7, catch the A train to Columbia for classes, work a part-time job at the university's IT help desk until 6 p.m., then return home to continue building what he believed would change everything. His classmates saw his dedication as admirable but naive. Another brilliant kid from the hood who thought technology could save him. They didn't know about the nights when Marcus sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and pages of algorithmic equations, working on artificial intelligence models that could predict market trends with unprecedented accuracy. They couldn't see the revolutionary neural network he'd been perfecting, one that had caught the attention of 3 major tech companies who'd been quietly bidding for his innovations. 18 months ago, everything changed. Marcus had been in Professor Williams's advanced machine learning class when his phone buzzed with an email that made his hands tremble. TechCrunch wanted to interview him about his AI breakthrough. Within weeks, venture capitalists were calling. Within months, bidding wars had begun. The algorithm he'd developed in his cramped apartment, the one his classmates dismissed as another student project, had just sold to Goldman Sachs for $847 million. But Marcus had learned something valuable growing up in two worlds. Wealth without wisdom was meaningless, and respect had to be earned through character, not bank accounts. So he continued wearing his college hoodies and riding the subway. He kept living in Washington Heights, though he'd bought his mother a house in Westchester. He still worked on new projects at his kitchen table, though now he could afford any office in Manhattan. The reservation at Le Bernardin wasn't about flaunting newfound wealth. It was about celebrating a milestone. His second AI innovation, a healthcare diagnostic tool, had just been acquired by Johns Hopkins for $1.2 billion. At 24, Marcus had become the youngest black tech entrepreneur to earn billionaire status. But more importantly, his innovations would help save thousands of lives. He'd wanted to mark this achievement somewhere significant, somewhere that represented the heights, he'd dreamed of reaching during those long nights in his studio apartment. Le Bernardin had seemed perfect, elegant, respected, transformative. He'd booked the reservation using his Platinum American Express Centurion card, the same card that had been delivered to his apartment by personal courier just 3 months earlier. As Sandra continued her dismissive assessment, Marcus remembered his mother's words from that morning. "Baby, success isn't about proving you belong in their spaces. It's about transforming those spaces by bringing your authentic self into them." Standing in the restaurant's marble foyer, surrounded by the whispered judgments of people who saw only his appearance, Marcus felt the familiar tension between worlds. Part of him wanted to walk away, to return to the comfort of spaces where his worth wasn't questioned. But another part, the part that had spent countless hours building something extraordinary, knew that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in boardrooms or laboratories. They were fought in moments. Exactly like this one. Sandra's colleague Melissa approached, carrying a tray of champagne glasses for a nearby table. She paused, observing the situation with growing discomfort. "Sandra," she whispered, "maybe we should check with management before—" "Before what?" Sandra cut her off, her voice gaining confidence as other diners began to notice the commotion. "Before we maintain the standards that make this place special? Look at him, Melissa. Look at those clothes. This isn't about discrimination. It's about appropriateness." Marcus reached slowly into his backpack, his movements deliberate and calm. The other diners were watching now, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable recognition that they were witnessing something significant. His fingers closed around his wallet, not the worn leather one from college, but the custom piece that had come with his new banking tier. What happened next would change not just Marcus's evening, but the entire trajectory of how Le Bernardin understood the meaning of worth. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter as well-dressed patrons turned their attention toward the unfolding drama at the host station. The soft lighting that had seemed elegant moments before now felt harsh and exposing as Marcus stood surrounded by questioning stares. Sandra's confidence grew with each passing second and every curious glance from the restaurant's clientele. She'd handled situations like this before. People who wandered in off the street, convinced they could access a world that wasn't meant for them. In her mind, she was protecting the establishment's reputation, maintaining the standards that kept Le Bernardin at the pinnacle of New York dining. "Sir," Sandra said, her voice carrying across the marble foyer with practiced authority, "I'm going to have to insist that you leave. You're making our other guests uncomfortable." Marcus glanced around at the faces watching them, some with obvious discomfort, others with the kind of morbid curiosity reserved for watching accidents unfold. A middle-aged couple near the window whispered behind their menus, while a table of business executives had paused their conversation entirely to observe. "I haven't done anything to make anyone uncomfortable," Marcus replied, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "I simply want to honor my reservation and enjoy a meal." "Your alleged reservation," Sandra corrected, emphasizing the word with obvious skepticism. "And frankly, even if you had one, this isn't the kind of establishment where people show up looking like they just rolled out of bed." The hostess, emboldened by Sandra's assertiveness, nodded in agreement. "We have dress standards for a reason. Our clientele expects a certain atmosphere." Marcus felt the familiar weight of being reduced to his appearance, of having his worth measured by fabric and brand names rather than character or achievement. It was the same feeling he'd experienced in college, when professors assumed he was there on charity rather than merit. The same sensation that had followed him through job interviews where his credentials seemed invisible beneath the color of his skin and the modesty of his attire. But 18 months of success had taught him something new about power. Real power wasn't about proving yourself to people who'd already decided your worth. Real power was about maintaining dignity, while others revealed their character. "I understand your concern about atmosphere," Marcus said, reaching into his backpack with deliberate calm. "But I think there might be a misunderstanding about what kind of customer I am." Sandra rolled her eyes, sharing a knowing look with the hostess. "Let me guess. You're somebody important? You're going to call the manager? You know the owner?" Her voice carried the mocking tone of someone who'd heard similar claims before. "Actually," Marcus replied, his hand emerging from his backpack, with a slim leather wallet, "I was simply planning to pay for my meal and enjoy the experience I reserved." "With what?" Sandra laughed, the sound carrying across the restaurant like breaking glass. "Your student loan money? Look, kid, I've seen this before. Young guys who think they can impress dates by bringing them to places they can't afford. But there's no shame in being honest about your budget. There are plenty of nice chain restaurants where—" Marcus opened his wallet, the motion so simple and quiet that it seemed almost anticlimactic. Inside, nestled between what appeared to be several black cards, was something that made Sandra's words die in her throat. The American Express Centurion card, known in exclusive financial circles as the Black Card, gleamed under the restaurant's crystal chandeliers. Made of titanium and available only by invitation to clients with exceptional wealth, it was a symbol recognized by anyone who worked in high-end service industries. The card that Sandra was staring at represented not just purchasing power, but membership in an elite financial tier occupied by fewer than 100,000 people worldwide. The hostess leaned closer, her practiced eye immediately recognizing what she was seeing. Her face went pale as the implications hit her. This wasn't just any credit card. This was the kind of financial instrument that could buy the entire restaurant without requiring a loan. "That's—" Sandra began, but her voice faltered as she processed what she was looking at. The mockery that had filled her tone seconds earlier evaporated, replaced by something that sounded dangerously close to panic. Marcus held the card between two fingers, letting the light catch its distinctive surface. "I believe this should cover my dinner," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the triumph Sandra might have expected. Instead, there was something sadder, the weary disappointment of someone who'd hoped for better. The restaurant fell into a silence so complete that the soft jazz playing through the sound system seemed suddenly thunderous. Every diner within sight was now staring openly, their conversations abandoned as they tried to process what they were witnessing. Melissa, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, stepped forward. "Sandra," she whispered urgently, "do you realize what that is?" But Sandra was already realizing, her face cycling through shades of confusion, recognition, and finally, terror. The black card wasn't just about money. It was about connections, influence, and the kind of power that could end careers with a single phone call. Marcus carefully returned the card to his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate. "Now," he said, his voice carrying across the silent restaurant, "I believe you mentioned something about checking your reservation system again." That night, in his Washington Heights apartment, Marcus sat at the same kitchen table where he'd written the code that changed his life. The laptop screen cast a blue glow across technical documents and financial statements that told the story of an extraordinary 18 months. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about algorithms or acquisition deals. He was thinking about his mother. Carmen Thompson had been 20 years old when she gave birth to Marcus, a single mother working 2 jobs to support them both. She'd cleaned office buildings at night and studied nursing during the day, carrying Marcus to classes when she couldn't afford childcare. Their apartment had been even smaller then, a one-bedroom in the Bronx where Marcus slept on a fold-out couch and did his homework at the kitchen table while his mother studied for her nursing exams. The walls had been covered with post-it notes back then. Reminders, encouragement, dreams written in Spanish and English. "Mijo, you're going to change the world," Carmen would whisper when Marcus struggled with math homework. "Your brain is a gift from God, but what you do with it is your gift to the world." Marcus had believed her, even when teachers suggested he consider more realistic career paths, even when guidance counselors recommended community college over his dreams of Columbia, even when classmates made jokes about the scholarship kid who studied while they partied. The breakthrough had come during his junior year in Professor Williams's Advanced Machine Learning Seminar. While other students worked on standard neural network projects, Marcus had become obsessed with a different problem. Could artificial intelligence predict market volatility by analyzing patterns invisible to human observation? Night after night, he'd sat at this same kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks and empty coffee cups, writing code that seemed impossible. His algorithm didn't just analyze traditional market indicators, it processed social media sentiment, weather patterns, political discourse, even satellite imagery of shopping mall parking lots. The neural network learned to see connections that eluded even the most sophisticated Wall Street analysts. The first breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in October. Marcus had been testing his model against historical data when the screen filled with predictions that seemed too accurate to believe. His algorithm hadn't just identified market trends, it had predicted them with 94.7% accuracy across 5 years of historical data. Within weeks, word had leaked through Columbia's computer science department. A venture capitalist's daughter, impressed by a presentation in Professor Williams's class, had mentioned Marcus's work to her father. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning, while Marcus sat in his algorithms and data structures class. "Mr. Thompson, this is David Chen from Goldman Sachs. We'd like to discuss your predictive modeling work." The meeting had been surreal. Marcus, wearing his best thrift store suit, had sat in a Goldman Sachs conference room overlooking Manhattan, explaining his algorithm to executives who earned more in bonuses than most people saw in lifetimes. They'd understood immediately what he'd created. Not just a trading tool, but a revolutionary approach to understanding market behavior. The bidding war had been swift and intense. Google offered $200 million, Microsoft countered with $350 million. But Goldman Sachs understood what Marcus had built better than anyone. They offered $847 million for exclusive rights, plus a consulting contract worth another $200 million over 5 years. Marcus had called his mother from the Goldman Sachs lobby, his hands shaking as he tried to explain what had just happened. Carmen had cried, not just tears of joy, but tears of vindication. Every double shift, every sacrificed weekend, every moment when she'd chosen her son's education over her own comfort, had led to this moment. But success, Marcus learned, came with its own challenges. The second algorithm, a healthcare diagnostic tool that could identify diseases from patient data with unprecedented accuracy, had attracted even more attention. Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and 3 pharmaceutical companies had entered a bidding war that ultimately reached $1.2 billion. At 24, Marcus had become one of the youngest billionaires in American history. But he'd learned something crucial. Wealth without wisdom was meaningless. The same society that now celebrated his innovations had spent years dismissing his potential. The same people who now sought his attention had once looked through him as if he were invisible. He'd moved his mother to a beautiful house in Westchester, paid off her nursing school loans, and established a scholarship fund for underrepresented students in STEM fields. But Marcus himself had chosen to remain in Washington Heights, in the apartment where his dreams had been born. The reservation at Le Bernardin had been about marking a milestone, not just financial success, but the completion of his third major, innovation, an environmental monitoring system that could predict climate changes with extraordinary precision. 3 government agencies and 2 international organizations were currently bidding for the technology. But sitting at his kitchen table, remembering Sandra's dismissive laughter and the hostess's skeptical stares, Marcus realized something profound. The restaurant had offered him more than just a meal. It had offered him a choice. He could use his newfound power to seek revenge, to humiliate those who had humiliated him, or he could use it to create something better. His mother's words echoed. In his mind, "Your brain is a gift from God, but what you do with it is your gift to the world." Tomorrow he would return to Le Bernardin, but not for the reasons anyone might expect. The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn and made his way to Le Bernardin 2 hours before the restaurant opened. The streets of Manhattan were quiet, filled only with delivery trucks and early commuters. He carried a leather portfolio that contained documents no one at the restaurant would expect to see. Using connections he'd developed through his business dealings, Marcus had spent the night researching Le Bernardin's ownership structure, staff, demographics, and community involvement. What he'd discovered was both troubling and illuminating. The restaurant, despite its reputation for excellence, had virtually no diversity in management positions and had never participated in any community outreach programs in neighborhoods like his own. More importantly, Marcus had learned something about Sandra Mitchell that changed his entire perspective on the previous evening's encounter. Sandra was a single mother of 2, working at Le Bernardin to support her children after her ex-husband had disappeared, leaving her with crushing debt and no child support. She lived in Queens, commuted 90 minutes each way to work, and had been struggling to keep up with rent increases that had pushed her family to the edge of financial catastrophe. Her sharp judgment the night before hadn't just been about maintaining restaurant standards. It had been about protecting a job she desperately needed to survive. Rather than feeling vindicated by this information, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Empathy. Sandra's dismissive behavior, while wrong, had come from a place of fear. Fear of losing the stability that her family depended on. At 8 a.m., Marcus positioned himself across the street from Le Bernardin and made a phone call to the restaurant's general manager, Michel Dubois. "Mr. Dubois, this is Marcus Thompson. I believe we need to discuss what happened in your restaurant last night." The conversation was brief but transformative. Within an hour, Marcus was sitting in the restaurant's private dining room with Michel, the owner, and the management team. On the table between them were documents that would change not just Le Bernardin, but the entire landscape of how high-end restaurants thought about community engagement. Marcus had prepared a proposal that was as elegant as it was revolutionary. He wanted to establish a scholarship program that would bring culinary students from underserved communities to train at Le Bernardin. He wanted to create a mentorship program that would pair the restaurant's chefs with young people interested in hospitality careers. And he wanted to fund a community dining program that would bring Le Bernardin's excellence to neighborhoods that had never experienced fine dining. The total investment, $50 million over 5 years. But Marcus had one specific condition. He wanted Sandra Mitchell to become the program's coordinator, not as punishment, but as an opportunity. Her experience as a working mother from a struggling community made her uniquely qualified to identify young people who could benefit from these opportunities. When Sandra arrived for her shift that afternoon, she was asked to join the meeting. Her face went pale when she saw Marcus sitting at the conference table. But his first words surprised her. "Sandra, I owe you an apology," Marcus said quietly. "Last night, I let my pride get in the way of understanding why you reacted the way you did. I learned about your situation, and I realize you were just trying to protect your job and your family." Sandra's eyes filled with tears as she processed his words. She'd spent the night lying awake, certain that she would be fired, and that her children would lose their home. "But I also want to offer you something," Marcus continued. "An opportunity to help other people who come from where we both come from. People who deserve chances that society doesn't always give them." He outlined the scholarship program, the mentorship opportunities, and the community outreach initiative. Then he explained Sandra's potential role as coordinator, a position that would double her salary and give her the chance to transform lives instead of simply serving tables. "Why?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After what I did to you, why would you help me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his mother's words, about the nights he'd spent coding at his kitchen table, about all the times people had judged him by his appearance rather than his potential. "Because," he said finally, "success isn't about proving you belong in their spaces. It's about transforming those spaces by bringing your authentic self into them. And sometimes that means helping others discover their authentic selves too." The room fell silent as the implications of Marcus's proposal settled over everyone present. This wasn't just about charity or public relations. It was about fundamentally changing how an industry thought about talent, opportunity, and worth. Sandra looked around the room at the faces watching her, the owner, the manager, the team of people who had witnessed her mistakes the night before. Then she looked back at Marcus, who was offering her not just forgiveness, but transformation. "I accept," she said simply, "and I promise you won't regret this." Marcus smiled, the same quiet smile that had carried him through years of being underestimated. "I don't think I will." 3 months later, Le Bernardin had become something unprecedented in Manhattan's dining scene, a Michelin-starred restaurant that served both billionaire tech entrepreneurs and scholarship recipients from Harlem community colleges. The transformation hadn't been without challenges, but it had been remarkable. Sandra Mitchell stood in the restaurant's main dining room on a busy Friday evening, wearing a tailored blazer that marked her new role as community program coordinator. Her responsibilities had expanded far beyond what Marcus had initially outlined. She now managed a staff of 12 people who worked exclusively on community outreach, scholarship administration, and mentorship programming. The changes were visible throughout the restaurant. The host station displayed information about upcoming community events alongside reservation confirmations. The walls featured photographs of scholarship recipients working alongside world-renowned chefs. Most importantly, the staff had been trained to see potential rather than just appearance, to welcome talent regardless of how it was packaged. On this particular evening, Sandra noticed a young woman standing uncertainly at the entrance. The girl looked to be about 19, wearing a chef's jacket that was clearly borrowed and shoes that had seen better days. She carried herself with the nervous energy of someone who wasn't sure she belonged, but was determined to try anyway. Sandra approached with a warm smile, a change that would have been impossible 3 months earlier. "Good evening. How can I help you?" "I'm Maria Santos," the young woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent. "I'm here for the Community Chef Program interview." Sandra's eyes lit up with recognition. Maria was one of 25 applicants for the restaurant's newest initiative, a program that brought promising culinary students from community colleges into Le Bernardin for intensive training. The girl's application had been extraordinary, describing her work cooking for her family's food truck, while taking night classes at Borough of Manhattan Community College. Maria, we've been looking forward to meeting you. I'm Sandra Mitchell, the program coordinator. As Sandra led Maria through the restaurant toward the private dining room where interviews were conducted, she caught sight of a familiar figure at table 12. Marcus Thompson sat alone, working on his laptop while enjoying what had become his weekly dinner at Le Bernardin. He'd kept his promise to return regularly, but now his presence served a different purpose. He mentored young entrepreneurs who came through the various programs he'd funded. Their eyes met across the dining room, and Marcus nodded with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching his vision come to life. The transformation hadn't been just about changing a restaurant, it had been about changing an entire ecosystem of opportunity. In the interview room, Maria sat across from executive chef Guillaume Laurent and sous chef James Parker, both of whom had initially been skeptical of Marcus's community programs. Their skepticism had dissolved quickly once they began working with the scholarship recipients and realized the untapped talent that existed in communities they'd never considered. "Tell us about your experience," Chef Laurent said, his thick French accent warming as he spoke. Maria straightened in her chair, her nervousness giving way to passionate confidence as she began describing her culinary journey. She spoke about learning traditional Mexican techniques from her grandmother, about adapting recipes for the food truck's limited equipment, about dreaming of someday opening a restaurant that would honor her heritage while reaching new audiences. As she talked, Sandra found herself remembering her own interview just 3 months earlier. How terrified she'd been, how certain that her mistake with Marcus had ended any possibility of advancement. Marcus's decision to offer opportunity instead of punishment had changed not just her life, but her entire understanding of how power could be used. The interview lasted 90 minutes, with Maria demonstrating knife skills, discussing flavor, profiles, and presenting a business plan for a restaurant concept that would serve elevated Mexican cuisine in an accessible format. By the end, both chefs were leaning forward with obvious interest. "When can you start?" Chef Laurent asked finally. Maria's eyes filled with tears of joy and relief. "Tomorrow, if you need me." After Maria left, Sandra walked back into the main dining room where Marcus was finishing his meal. She approached his table with a confidence that still surprised her sometimes. "Another success story," she reported, sitting down across from him. "Maria Santos. She's going to be extraordinary." Marcus looked up from his laptop, genuine pleasure crossing his face. "That's what, 15 scholarship recipients placed in full-time positions now?" 16, actually. And the community dining program served its 1,000th guest last week. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both aware of how dramatically their lives had changed since that first confrontational evening. Sandra had become one of New York's most respected advocates for hospitality industry diversity. Marcus had used his success to create sustainable change rather than just accumulating wealth. "You know what I realized today?" Sandra said suddenly. "That night, when I judged you so harshly, I wasn't just wrong about who you were. I was wrong about who I could become." Marcus smiled, the same quiet smile that had sustained him through years of being underestimated. "That's the thing about transformation," he replied. "It's never just about one person. When we change how we see others, we change how we see ourselves." 1 year after that transformative evening, Le Bernardin hosted an event that made culinary history. The Rising Stars Gala brought together scholarship recipients, community leaders, industry professionals, and the media to celebrate the restaurant's revolutionary approach to hospitality education and community engagement. The main dining room had been transformed for the occasion. Tables were arranged to showcase work from students in the various programs Marcus had funded. Culinary creations that blended traditional techniques with innovative approaches, each dish telling a story of opportunity realized and potential unlocked. Sandra stood at the front of the room, wearing an elegant black dress that reflected her transformation from struggling waitress to respected program director. In her hands, she held a leather-bound report documenting the initiative's first-year impact. 127 scholarship recipients, 89 job placements, 2,400 community members served through the outreach dining program, and partnerships established with 15 culinary schools across the 5 boroughs. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the human stories that filled the room. Maria Santos, the nervous young woman who had interviewed 3 months earlier, now worked as a line cook at Le Bernardin while completing her culinary degree. Her innovations in Mexican-French fusion had already caught the attention of Food and Wine magazine, and she had been invited to compete on Top Chef's upcoming season. James Rodriguez, a formerly incarcerated individual who had learned cooking in a prison, now managed the community outreach kitchen and was preparing to open his own catering business with a microloan from the program's Business Development Fund. Dr. Angela Williams, a pediatric surgeon who had grown up in the same Washington Heights neighborhood as Marcus, served as the program's medical consultant and helped design nutrition education components that reached into local schools. As Sandra prepared to address the crowd, she spotted familiar faces throughout the room. Chef Laurent beamed proudly as he watched former scholarship recipients demonstrate advanced techniques to a group of food industry executives. The hostess, who had turned Marcus away that first night, now trained in unconscious bias awareness, welcomed community members with genuine warmth. Near the back of the room, Marcus sat at a table with his mother, Carmen, who had become an unofficial advisor to the program. Her nursing background had proven invaluable in developing health-focused menu options for the community dining initiatives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sandra began, her voice carrying clearly through the restaurant's refined acoustics. A year ago, this room was beautiful, but it wasn't complete. It served extraordinary food to extraordinary people, but it didn't serve its extraordinary potential. She paused, her eyes finding Marcus in the crowd. That changed, because one young man refused to let judgment define him. Instead of seeking revenge when he was dismissed and humiliated, Marcus Thompson chose to create opportunity. Instead of proving he belonged in our space, he transformed our space into something better. The audience applauded, but Sandra raised her hand to continue. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Marcus didn't just change a restaurant. He changed an industry. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that the Le Bernardin Community Excellence Model has been adopted by 37 restaurants across New York City, with plans for national expansion next year. The applause grew thunderous as Sandra outlined the broader impact. Major culinary schools were implementing similar scholarship programs. Restaurant groups were establishing their own community partnerships. The James Beard Foundation had created a new award category, recognizing excellence in hospitality, equity, and inclusion. Most importantly, Sandra continued, her voice growing emotional, this program has taught us that talent exists everywhere. Genius wears work boots and speaks with accents. Innovation comes from necessity, not privilege. And excellence has nothing to do with where you come from, and everything to do with what you're willing to build. Marcus was invited to the podium, and as he walked through the dining room, he was struck by the transformation not just of the space, but of the people who filled it. Community college students sat next to venture capitalists, sharing stories and insights that bridged worlds. that had rarely intersected before. "When I walked into this restaurant a year ago," Marcus began, his voice quiet but carrying easily through the room, "I thought I was just trying to enjoy a meal. I didn't realize I was walking into the beginning of something extraordinary." He spoke about the scholarship recipients who had surpassed every expectation, about the community members who had discovered new passions through the outreach programs, about the industry professionals who had expanded their understanding of what hospitality could mean. "But most of all," Marcus concluded, "I learned that transformation isn't about proving you belong in someone else's space. It's about creating spaces where everyone belongs, where potential is recognized regardless of how it's packaged, where opportunity isn't determined by appearance but by character and determination." As the evening concluded with a reception featuring dishes created entirely by program participants, Sandra found herself standing next to Marcus, both of them watching the connections being made throughout the room. "You did something remarkable here," she told him quietly. Marcus shook his head, smiling. "We did something remarkable. All of us. Together." The transformation was complete, but the impact was just beginning. 2 years later, Marcus Thompson stood in the same Le Bernardin dining room, but everything had changed. The restaurant had become a model for the entire hospitality industry, featured in Harvard Business School case studies and visited by delegations from around the world, seeking to understand how prejudice could be transformed into progress. Sandra Mitchell had been promoted to Vice President of Community Relations, overseeing programs that now operated in 12 cities. She'd completed her master's degree in nonprofit management, funded by a scholarship from Marcus's foundation, and had become a sought-after speaker on topics of workplace equity and second chances. The scholarship program had evolved into something far greater than anyone had imagined. Over 300 young people had received full culinary education funding, with 89% completing their programs and 94% finding employment in their chosen fields. 15 program graduates had opened their own restaurants, creating hundreds of additional jobs in communities that had previously been overlooked by the fine dining industry. But perhaps most importantly, the culture of judgment that had defined that first encounter had been replaced by something revolutionary: the presumption of potential rather than the assumption of inadequacy. On this particular evening, Marcus wasn't alone. He was hosting dinner for a group of young entrepreneurs from his latest initiative, a technology incubator focused on innovations that addressed social inequality. The conversation around his table was animated, filled with ideas about artificial intelligence applications for education equity and blockchain solutions for financial inclusion. As dessert was served, Marcus looked around the room and saw the future he'd helped create. At one table, a former scholarship recipient who now served as a sous chef was explaining molecular gastronomy techniques to a group of community college students. At another, venture capitalists were discussing investment opportunities with entrepreneurs from backgrounds they'd never previously considered. "You know what I learned from all this?" Marcus said to his dinner companions. "Success isn't measured by how high you can climb alone. It's measured by how many people you can lift while you're climbing." Sandra approached the table, carrying a framed article from that morning's New York Times. "From Prejudice to Progress: How One Restaurant Changed an Industry." The article had already been shared over 100,000 times on social media, sparking conversations about bias, opportunity, and transformation across the country. "The story's not over," Sandra said with a smile. "It's just beginning," Marcus nodded, understanding that the young man who had walked into Le Bernardin 2 years ago, seeking only a meal, had inadvertently started a movement. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with grand gestures but with quiet dignity in the face of injustice, and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. The lesson was simple but profound. Never judge potential by appearance, because genius comes in all packages, and the person you dismiss today might just be the one who changes your world tomorrow.